Hey, you, want to have a free will debate? Yeah, neither do I, especially since the overwhelming majority go absolutely nowhere worthwhile. But that's kind of the point, I think, because this really demonstrates where some of these ideas coincide with the tactics of the religious. Because nobody is perfect, and lots of people need to think harder about what they believe. So, we're going to have a talk today, not necessarily about free will. I mean, you can find that absolutely everywhere online, but about where virtually all of these discussions go wrong, at least in my personal opinion. This is what happens when you get emotion involved and really when you lack the capacity to step back and follow your ideas to their rationally logical conclusion. This is going to be a long one, I'm afraid, and we're going to have a special guest along to help. Sort of. Kind of. You'll see what I mean. So anyway, away we go. So, I just wanted to talk for a minute up front before we got into anything else, because there are problems that I see constantly when it comes to debates on free will. More often than not, and remember, this is just my opinion, so take it as you will just see people talking past each other. They're not really talking to each other. They're just out in the weeds someplace, talking to themselves about things that, I don't know. Just that's what I see. Mostly, people are not willing to define their terms up front in any worthwhile, demonstrable way. And some of that is because if this is actually being debated, mostly because there really aren't any worthwhile definitions to be had, but most of the time, I don't know that the people involved actually know how to define their terms. A lot of it just starts to look like faith on the part of the adherent. Well, this is true. Yeah, okay, how do you know that? How have you tested it to see if it stands up to any kind of critical rigor? And you notice that's the same questions that I ask of the religious because the same thing applies. There are no double standards for anyone. There is no free will. Well, all right, first, define what you mean by free will in some comprehensible way, and then explain how you've come to your conclusion intellectually. Be sure to provide sufficient evidence to show that your ideas are actually defensible. Yet the problem is, I've yet to find anyone who could actually do any of that, at least not to my satisfaction. There is always a point where they just have to take a leap of faith, for lack of a better word, and hope that nobody calls them on it. And whether they like that or not, I always do. And that's where the problems tend to come in. So, I'm going to use some clips from a recent episode of The Atheist Experience. Recent at the time that I'm making this, not so much by the time it shows up, so keep that in mind, just to illustrate my points. This is not intended to call out Matt Dillahunty or anybody else. It's just to demonstrate some of the problems that I have when engaging in this kind of debate. Because, trust me, he is not remotely alone in having these problems. And remember, this is just my opinion, and that counts for absolutely nothing. You can push him right to a certain point, and he just won't budge beyond it. He won't consider anything beyond that point. And there are some other things that he has this problem in, but we're going to focus on free will today. And that's really pretty frustrating when you're trying to have a discussion with someone who may be a generally rational person. They've just got an emotional attachment to their particular conclusion, and they just don't want to budge. And if you notice, the religious act pretty much the same way. It's the same problem. It's not a religious problem, it's a human problem, and that comes up a lot. Now, don't get me wrong, it's hard to keep asking how people know that incessantly in some of these conversations, but sometimes it is necessary because we are really at a point where we just don't know anything, but a lot of people really wish that we did. So they find a comfortable spot where they can just hang their hat, at least for the moment, and then they really don't want to put it back on their head. And personally, I find that pretty problematic. And let's see if you agree.
I just want to make sure that I understood what you're saying. So basically, you hold the position of compatibilists and not hardcore determinists, basically, or?
No. So compatibilism is the notion that determinism and free will are not in conflict. And I accept that with that particular definition of free will. Under a normative definition of free will, I don't claim that we have it. I just claim that I have will. I have no idea how free it is or isn't.
Now, keep in mind, I'm just taking snippets from the conversation, and if you want to see the whole thing in context, and I always recommend that people do, then the link is in the description. Go take a look for yourself. This is, as a lot of the things that I'm doing, a launching point for evaluating these free will arguments, or any arguments that I actually happen to look at. But in this, yes, I do think that he's generally right because he's not actually making a claim here. We clearly have a will of some sort. We don't actually understand it. I don't think anybody can rationally say that we do. And we'll kind of go into that a little bit later, but we do not have any idea if it's actually free, nor can I actually see any way that we could actually make that determination, at least today, in any way that I can fathom. This is really where definitions are so essential. When one person defines their version of free will, it may be completely contradictory to what somebody else is talking about. A lot of them are even self-contradictory to themselves, as I think we're going to touch on later. We can be dancing on a very fine thread here. And I'm not saying that Matt is, but in general terms, remember, this is just a launching point for a discussion. I do see that kind of thing happening all the time.
Makes sense. Okay, so I think I hold the same position because I don't believe that I'm not determinist, but I don't believe that I have like 100% pure free will. Why? Because that contradicts like the fact, because as a being, I am dependent on many other things that are eventually controlled by God, right?
No, since you can't actually demonstrate that God exists. But that's not really here or there. It's part of a different discussion that we could have, but this is about free will. But there's part of the definitional problem that I see, so we're going to go off the video for a moment. I see a lot of people who are defining free will as absolutely nothing at all can influence me, period. Yet, that's kind of a ridiculous thing to assert. We live in a demonstrably deterministic causal universe, whether we like it or not. Everything that I am, everything that you are, all of that has been influenced by all of the things that you have ever been, all of the things that you've ever seen, all of the things that you've ever experienced throughout your entire life. You are not, and I think it's completely idiotic to assert that you are, a completely free agent, free from any impact from the world around you that you happen to live in. If that's the definition of free will that you're pushing, stop the train and let me off, because that's an absolutely ridiculous position to take. Define your terms in some way that's actually reasonable. And if you can do that, then sure, we can have a discussion.
That's what theists believe.
I'm not dependent on anything that anyone has ever demonstrated is controlled by a God.
I'm just talking from a theist perspective, not talking from your perspective.
Now, this is one of the places that I'm just going to skip ahead because I don't want to turn this into a religious discussion. We do that a lot around here anyway. If you want to do that, there's 1,000 videos on this channel that you can go look at. You can certainly make it a religious discussion, and let's be honest, a lot of the problems that the religious have are the same problems that we're going to discuss here today, but that's kind of part of the point. Once you're engaging in an emotional dialogue over what you want to be true, you're really not any better off than the religious are who do the same thing all the time. It's another case of step the hell back and deal with the facts and not your emotional fantasy. So we're going to jump forward a little bit and I'll see you on the other side.
No problem. So why do you consider yourself compatibilist and not hardcore determinist? Like, why there's this notion of will in your?
Why do you keep phrasing it as? Why do you keep phrasing it as compatibilist or hardcore determinist? Determinism is true. Whether it's soft determinism or hard determinism, we don't know. But both of them are potentially in conflict with some models of free will. There are other models of free will, one that Dennett puts forth, which I'm not convinced is in conflict with determinism. But I don't care about that.
And here's the problem that I have most of the time when I'm debating this. And like I said, I really don't like debating this anymore because this is the kind of stuff I run into. I don't know if I'm just really unlucky, but I tend to run into a lot of really, really hardcore, hard determinists who seem to think that there can be absolutely no free will because everything, absolutely everything, has been perfectly predetermined since the moment of the Big Bang. And I actually mean that. I have run into people who have told me that if we had a sufficient understanding of absolutely everything that happened at the first few instants after the Big Bang, we could predict with absolute perfect certainty absolutely everything that has happened or will ever happen, period. You can't possibly have free will because you are just a pre-programmed meat robot that is just following the whims of the motions of atoms established billions and billions of years in the past. Now, that might make a certain amount of sense until you actually think about the logical ramifications. If we're not going with the God model, the idea that there's some overarching intelligence that's making the universe perform the way that it wants, then that actually makes absolutely zero sense based on what we see in the real world. What we see in the universe is a type of complexity and order, and we'll get that out of the way right up front without turning this into some creationism crap. Because remember, I'm not trying to make this into something religious, but we see patterns that are just not explainable through that kind of thinking. It means that 13.7 billion years ago, it was predetermined that I would make this video. And you, who are sitting out there somewhere watching it, you had no choice whatsoever but to sit down and watch it. You have no choice whatsoever. This is something that you're doing because you've been programmed to do it. If you leave a comment below, which I always encourage people to do, you can't choose not to. You can't choose what you write because it's already been determined. If you make a typo, that was determined too. You were programmed by the universe to produce exactly those letters in that specific pattern such that other people could read it and that it would somehow make sense to them. You could not have done anything else. The particles in your brain, the particles that control how it fires, they are doing exactly what they were programmed to do billions of years ago, and you have absolutely no choice in the matter. Everything from Planck time forward has been following an insanely complicated script. And that, my friends, is a really, really stupid idea. But I guess I don't have a choice but to think that, do I?
Okay, so I think it would be easier to discuss this probably in examples. For example, when you wake up in the morning and you want to choose between, like you have blue pants, red pants, you want to choose between both. Like, are you determined? Like, once you pick up one, were you determined to pick one, or it was you who actually chose which one you could pick?
I don't know. I don't think the answer is known or knowable. Well, I won't say that it's for sure unknowable. I don't know, and I don't know of any way that anybody could say that they do know.
Yet lots of people out there are convinced that they not only can know, but that somehow they do know. And that's kind of a problem when you think about it. This brings us back to my ice cream example, and I've gone over this before. You've probably seen it, and if you haven't, there's videos out there on that, where I say if I walk into an ice cream shop and they offer, I don't know, 50 flavors of ice cream, just as a number I pulled out of my ass, I can, at least from my perspective, select any of them. I am not constrained in any way that I can personally identify. I can order one flavor, I can order multiple flavors, I can go up to the counter and try to order a hamburger if I want. I can also just walk out the door without ever getting a thing. I can be allergic to some of the flavors, but I can still order them anyway. I can order them knowing full well that they'll kill me. How stupid is that? It certainly seems to me that by any rational definition of free will, of which I am aware, that I do, in fact, have a choice. Yet the hardcore determinists, they will insist that I don't. I am constrained by something that they have absolutely no means to demonstrate. I mean, how would you even go about demonstrating that fact in the first place? What conceivable criteria would you have to use? Because it's not like you can do any experiments to discover the truth if you really believe that, because you can't do anything that you haven't already been programmed for. You are programmed to do whatever you're programmed to do. Period. In fact, the very claim that the determinists use to say that it was all predetermined, that was predetermined from the moment of the Big Bang too. So you have to think that all of these complex interactions between complex creatures that are clearly going on, completely separate from any kind of moderating intellect, you have to think that all of that has just come about completely naturally by the random interaction of atoms. And yeah, I don't buy it. I'm sorry, I just don't. Yes, we can explain how we came to be here. Evolution still works under the determinist model, but it's not the fact that we can seemingly engage in intelligent discussions where one side proposes a topic and the other side somehow provides a coherent answer. That can happen. But if you're looking at a purely determinist model, that makes no sense at all. Because when we actually look at it, those kind of complex interactions happen on a very, very regular basis. In fact, on those extremely rare occasions where you do get an answer that you just can't make any sense out of, we find that pretty odd. We kind of go, dude, what the hell are you talking about? How exactly do you defend this idea? Because you really can't.
Okay, so
And I don't care.
No.
And I genuinely don't care. When I get up in the morning, first of all, I'm probably not putting pants on at all.
Let me ask
But to the extent that I'm going to put on pants, to ask why I picked those pants instead of another, does it make any difference? If we reround the universe and played it again, do I think that that's what's going to happen? Yes, I'm convinced of determinism.
Then that makes no sense whatsoever. Because in that case, nothing matters. Nothing at all. You have to say exactly what you're saying to the caller because you have no more choice in the matter than you do in what color pants you decided to wear. Because you didn't decide anything. You have no capacity to decide anything. You were right back at square one where compatibilism isn't even a possibility because you're just a pre-programmed meat robot. And I think this is another case where these people aren't following their opinions to their logical conclusions. But I think we're going to get to that part later on too.
Yeah, because the reason why I'm asking this question is because, well, yeah, this example doesn't really make a difference in your life. But if we take it on another scale, like, for example, saying when somebody kills somebody else intentionally versus somebody else who just killed somebody accidentally, like, why the first one would be judged for 25 years and the other one would be judged for 6 months?
And this is where we're going to have some serious problems because from the hard determinist perspective, there can't be a difference. I mean, if you shoot somebody in the head or you back over them with your car, you can't possibly be culpable because you had no choice. You were just following the marching orders that the universe has provided to you. Now, this is where I think we're going to start seeing Matt get emotional. And to be fair, this is hardly the only thing that sets him off, but that's for a different video, or if you really care, for the blog post that I've put over on my blog, of which there are quite a few on this subject. This is really the point at which someone who doesn't accept free will has to acknowledge that absolutely nothing matters, because it doesn't under their mindset. It can't. It is impossible for it to. And they really can't argue otherwise, especially since, in their model, they can't argue for anything.
Because there's a difference between an intent and accident. There's a reason why when you look at something like the Bible and ancient codexes about laws and morality, they say something simple like thou shalt not kill. But when you look at what the law, like in the United States, has to say about what happens when one person kills another, we recognize that there are a lot of different circumstances there. And some of those, that's why you have murder 1, murder 2, murder 3, involuntary manslaughter, reckless endangerment, negligent homicide, etc. All of these different things, because we realize that all of these are different. But it doesn't matter if the person, let's say there's a person who walked into a place, absolutely hated and despised the person in the room with them, and intentionally shot them in the head. That can all be true, irrespective of whether they have free will or will. It doesn't matter, because if there is no free will, that still happens as a result of determinism. And if there is free will, it still happens as a result of free will. And the difference between someone who walks in and intentionally does that versus someone who accidentally backs their car over someone is night and day and has nothing at all to do with free will. They are still the agent who is responsible for that death. And we assess the consequences of that action and attribute a penalty based on the risks of recidivism, of it happening again, how much of a danger are they to the rest of society, what's the broader impact. Those are the factors. At no point is free will a consideration in the evaluation of this.
And let's be honest, Matt has completely abandoned the free will argument right there. And he does that a lot, if you notice. I'm not criticizing him. Well, I am, but I'm just pointing it out. Because if determinism is true, especially hard determinism, although soft determinism has its own share of problems, but we'll stick with the hard for the moment. But if that is true, then it is absolutely impossible to determine culpability because the individual has no choice whatsoever in the matter. Now, he's going to get to an example with a car in a moment, and I'm going to address that when we get to it, but we are little more than cars. Less, actually, because we have absolutely nothing to do with reality, in that we're just going around and doing whatever we're programmed to do, and we've got no choice whatsoever. In fact, nobody has a choice on how they react. Joe Blow was predetermined to blow off Bob Smith's head. The police were predetermined to catch them. The courts were predetermined to convict them of murder, and society was predetermined to put them in prison. There is absolutely nothing at all that anyone could conceivably have done to change any of those outcomes. So how can we possibly hold Joe Blow accountable for actions that he couldn't have helped but perform? Oh, right, because we had no choice but to do what we did too, right? And this is really where we have problems, because one of the more common definitions of free will that we see is you couldn't have done otherwise. Well, how the hell do you know that exactly? What experiments can you possibly perform to come to that conclusion? And keep in mind that even considering the question that was, according to the hard determinists, set in motion 13.7 billion years ago, and you don't have a choice but to hold those views to begin with right now, so none of it matters. And this brings us right back to, how the hell do you know that? Because you literally can't. This is the same thing the creationists are doing when they try to tell us the difference between created things and non-created things. They are convinced that absolutely everything is by definition created. There isn't a single example anywhere of anything that isn't. Therefore, there is no way to tell the difference by definition. Once you go down that rabbit hole, there is no point to even trying to do anything any longer because you're not having a conversation. You're just following a script.
That totally makes sense. But the thing is, like in an atheistic society, I would say, or even determinism, let's forget about atheism or theism or whatever. Let's just use the words determinism, basically. Like from a deterministic perspective, well, this person was determined to make such an action, so they're not really responsible for it. Like you cannot.
No. That's what I'm saying, Simo. They're still responsible.
But they can't be. Granted, we can't help but hold them responsible because we, like they, have no choice in the matter. We have to do what we're programmed to do just like they are. They're going to prison or whatever might happen to happen because that's what was predetermined from the beginning of time. So this whole thing is just a complete waste of our time. It's not worth even thinking about. Not like we have a choice in that either. Now, that's going off down a completely bizarre path because once you sign on to that and actually believe it, you're basically signing yourself out of reality. You don't really have a choice. That's why people have come up with all kinds of middle grounds. Once you sign on to the hardcore side, though, you got some problems. That's why you've got compatibilism, metaphysical libertarianism, theological determinism, etc., etc., etc. The list goes on and on. Because I think that most people recognize that there's a problem here, and they're just trying to rationalize their way around it, just like the religious do when they run into their problems. Because they are uncomfortable with admitting that we just don't know enough to make any kind of rational determination. And this is where I got into a discussion with someone who went into great detail about brain chemistry and all of that, showing that yes, at least some decisions are being made before we are consciously aware of them. Therefore, we have no free will, everything's predetermined, and that's the end of it. Yet that's not the only possibility. It's not even the most rational possibility. It's certainly more coherent to think that yeah, maybe we just don't know enough about consciousness or about the way the brain works as we'd like to think that we do. Maybe all the stuff that rolls around in the front of our heads that we consider consciousness, maybe that's just a mere sliver of what's actually going on. We are aware on a subconscious level of some sort of making these decisions, and it only makes it into the cognitive centers thereafter, if at all. We just don't know, and that's kind of the point. Yet lots of people don't want to accept that we're not at the top of our game right now. They want to think that we know it all and every decision we make is perfect. And that's not the way any of this works. We're just a bunch of apes trying to make sense of the world that we live in, and whether we like it or not, no matter how many times we go, ook, ook, eek, eek, that doesn't mean that we understand it. So let's stop pretending that we do.
If my car was defective...
That's meaningless.
No, listen to me. If my car was defective and it caught fire while I was running down the road, it would be correct of me to hold the car responsible and to go get it fixed.
No, it wouldn't, even if we weren't talking about free will. Your car has no cognitive functions of its own. It didn't do it on purpose. It didn't say, hey, let's go out and piss Matt off. It failed because some part of it within the laws of nature stopped functioning as it was supposed to. You don't go holding inanimate objects accountable because they happen to do things. And most of the time, they aren't even doing anything. It's just nature acting upon them, and there was no free will or any kind of a conscious decision whatsoever. So let's not go there.
It doesn't matter whether somebody had free will to hate someone and kill them, or if they accidentally killed them. They are the agent who's responsible. Free will is irrelevant.
Except it's not. It's all that is relevant. because we don't put your car in prison if the brakes happen to slip and it rolls down a hill and hits somebody. That would be just stupid. Which, again, in this whole free will nonsense, it wouldn't have a choice, and we'd have to put it where we were programmed to put it. And Jesus, this is just stupid. Anyway, we might look to the person who parked it there, and if they didn't properly maintain it, I suppose we could hold them responsible, but the car itself is completely blameless. It can't be to blame because it didn't make a decision. And if we go back to the free will discussion at hand, if there is no free will, then we can't make decisions either. We have the illusion of decisions. And because without free will, we can't even choose who we'll blame and who we won't, the whole question just becomes absurd. The second that you go down the hard deterministic path, there goes justice, there goes morality, there goes everything. Not that it actually matters, because none of those things actually exist in the first place. They're just the whims of the cosmos. And I don't know why people can't figure that out.
They are the agent responsible. And if it's a matter of necessity that we hold that agent responsible, if we get to a point where we can find out that that person killed because of a tumor in their head, if we get to the point where we can identify that removing that tumor makes that person no longer a risk to do that again, then haven't we solved the problem?
And you notice that he's getting really, really emotional here, right? Because I think this is very personal to him. And that's fine. I'm not criticizing him for that, but he has a serious emotional attachment to the issue, and that's caused him to completely take leave of his senses. He's off on another discussion altogether right now, and this isn't the only issue that he has. Just watch a couple of episodes of The Atheist Experience sometime, and you'll see that. He gets pissed off a lot. He rants and he raves and he cusses people out, and he hangs up whenever they hit one of his hot button issues because he lacks the ability to take a big step back from his emotions and just pursue the facts. And he's certainly not alone in that, both in the ACA and elsewhere, because lots of people do it. I'm not even sure that he's aware of what he's doing or if he cares. I'm sure it's been pointed out to him, but he doesn't change. This is just a really, really obvious example. And from my perspective, at least, it's a problem.
Well, I get your point, but the thing is, from a deterministic perspective again, and if you say like the brain is not just made a bunch of...
It doesn't matter. Determinism is irrelevant. It doesn't matter if you rewind the universe. No, Simo, stop.
And by now, he's so far gone that it's not really worth following along anymore. Simo, for all of his faults, and he's got plenty of them because he calls a lot, he kept trying to bring Matt back around, and Matt wasn't having any of it. He was off on a tear, doing his own thing, and this happens so often in these debates that it's not even surprising anymore. It's why I try as often as I can not to engage. Yeah, I do get sucked in sometimes, and I admit that, but the second that I see that I'm going off into crazy land territory, I just give up and walk away. Because what else can I do? You can't reason with the unreasonable. And this is where it all starts to look very much like religion. It's people using their emotions as a cudgel to defeat others, when it's really obvious that they've never really considered the ramifications of their positions, nor the actual issues involved. How do you know that? How have you verified that you're actually correct? And in this instance, how could you conceivably do any of that at all? It's like trying to debate somebody who is sincerely convinced that we're all living in the Matrix. Great. How do you test that? Of course, you can't, and there are always excuses and bald rationalizations for why the world that we see, it isn't really that because, reasons, because fifis. And I've had it up to here trying to debate people's emotions. I don't want to do it anymore. It doesn't get you anywhere. Let me know when you've got something intelligent to say, and I'll come right on back. So anyway, what did you think? Let me know in the comments and we'll have a conversation. Maybe, because we might not be able to. Because what you type, well, you didn't have a choice in it anyway. And I don't have a choice but to respond. So what's the point of it all? This is really stupid.